There are stories that age in silence, stories buried so deep that even the person living them forgets where the pain began. For Jessi Colter, the woman once celebrated as the soulful queen beside Waylon Jennings, silence was both her refuge and her prison. Decades passed before she found the courage to revisit the years that nearly destroyed her, the love that lifted her, the secrets that broke her, and the music that became her only way to speak when words would have been too dangerous. Jessi Colter was born Miriam Johnson in Phoenix, Arizona, in 1943. Long before she was a country star, she was the daughter of a Pentecostal preacher and a mother who played piano in church. Her early life was steeped in faith and music, though she quickly learned that the two could exist in a fragile tension. By her teenage years, she was performing in small clubs under her birth name, and her voice, smoky, soulful, and defiant, drew attention from local musicians. She married guitarist Dwayne Eddy in 1961, a union that promised glamour but brought distance. While Eddy's star rose, Jessi's ambitions were quietly dismissed, and her own artistry was reduced to the background hum of someone else's success. When the marriage dissolved in 1968, Jessi found herself at a crossroads, divorced, disillusioned, and uncertain if she belonged in the world she had once dreamed of conquering. It was during those lost years that she met Waylon Jennings, the man whose voice carried the rebellion of outlaw country and whose life burned with the intensity of constant motion. Their connection was immediate, a collision of passion and danger. Waylon saw in her what few others did, not a muse, not a shadow, but an equal. Yet what began as an alliance built on love and shared music soon turned into a storm neither could control. In the early 1970s, the outlaw country movement was reshaping Nashville, and Jessi stood at its center. She recorded with Waylon, Willie Nelson, and Tom Paul Glazer, lending her voice to songs that defied the industry's polished sound. Her 1975 hit I'm Not Lisa was a haunting confession, a cry from someone trapped between devotion and despair. The song climbed to number 1, earning her fame, but the woman behind it was crumbling. Fame didn't erase the shadows that followed her home. Behind closed doors, Waylon's growing addiction, paranoia, and absence began carving silent wounds into her life. The more the world cheered for their outlaw romance, the more Jessi learned to mask the fractures beneath it. By the time the spotlight turned its brightest, Jessi was no longer just a performer. She was a keeper of secrets, some hers, some Waylon's, and each one left a mark she would not reveal for decades. By 1976, Jessi Colter and Waylon Jennings were country music's most talked-about couple, the king and queen of rebellion, the golden pair of the outlaw movement. On stage, they were fire and grace, Waylon's raw voice cutting through smoke and applause, Jessi's harmonies softening the edges of his defiance. But behind the lights, their marriage was a battlefield of love, addiction, and exhaustion. The same spirit that made Waylon unstoppable on stage made him unpredictable at home. Waylon had fallen deep into cocaine and amphetamines, chasing an energy that no longer came naturally. The road was his escape, but it became a trap. Nights blurred into mornings, hotel rooms into hospitals. Jessi watched him disappear piece by piece, even as his fame soared higher than ever. There were nights he wouldn't sleep for days, and when he finally did, he'd wake in anger or confusion. Jessi learned to read the tremor in his hands, the shifting tone in his voice, the signs of another spiral coming. She tried to hold on, not as the famous wife of a legend, but as the woman who still believed there was something worth saving beneath the chaos. In interviews, she smiled and said they understood each other in ways no one else could. But the truth was harder. She had become the quiet caretaker of a man at war with himself. There were holes in walls, broken bottles, and long silences where love turned to survival. Still, she wrote songs, Sometimes in the middle of the night, her hands trembling, her voice low so he wouldn't hear. Her journals from those years reveal glimpses of what she endured, entries marked by half-finished lines, lyrics crossed out, confessions hidden between verses. "He's gone again," one note read. "The phone rings, but I don't answer. They ask where he is, and I say he's working. But I think he's lost. And yet, when he came home, she stayed. She believed the man who told her, 'You saved my life,' even when he was too far gone to save himself. Their bond was built on music, faith, and a shared loneliness that neither fame nor fortune could cure." Jessi began to understand that love, in its purest form, isn't always light. It's sometimes the thing you cling to in the dark, praying it doesn't burn you completely. By the late 1970s, fame had become a double-edged sword in the Jennings household. Waylon's voice was still raw and powerful on stage, but at home it trembled under the weight of paranoia and addiction. Cocaine and amphetamines had become his silent companions, lines drawn not just on mirrors, but across the cracks in his marriage. Jessi watched him disappear behind closed doors, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Each time he returned, his eyes seemed more distant, as though he was living in two realities, the outlaw legend adored by millions, and the frightened man drowning in his own fame. One night in 1978, after another show in Tucson, Waylon didn't come back to their hotel room. Jessi searched for him until she found the door slightly ajar in a small maintenance hallway. Room 214. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and silence. Waylon sat slumped in a chair, staring at a small wooden box on the floor. Next to it lay a folded letter with her name written in his handwriting. She didn't open it right away. Waylon looked at her, his face pale, his hands trembling. "If something happens to me," he said quietly, "don't let them find what's in there." She wanted to ask what he meant, but his gaze drifted away, already somewhere else, lost between guilt and the ghosts of the road. The box disappeared a week later. Waylon claimed he'd burned it, but Jessi wasn't sure. Years later, when he was gone, she would remember the faint scent of smoke on his jacket that night. Not from cigarettes, but from something heavier, final. The letter, though, she kept. Inside were only a few lines, scribbled in haste. "They'll tell you stories about me, Jess. Some of them true, some not. But there's one thing you should know. What happened in Tucson wasn't an accident." She never spoke of it again. But from that night on, her songs began to change. The joy that once filled her voice was replaced by something quieter, more haunted. "Storms never last," she would sing, her voice trembling not with weakness but with knowledge. It wasn't just a song anymore, so it was a confession, wrapped in melody. After Waylon's death in 2002, the house in Scottsdale grew impossibly quiet. Jessi would still set 2 cups on the table in the morning, out of habit. The second cup always stayed untouched. Grief didn't hit her all at once. It came in waves, slow and heavy, like the desert wind at dusk. For months, she couldn't bring herself to enter his old recording room. The smell of dust and nicotine lingered there, mixed with the faint metallic scent of guitar strings. It was a space frozen in time, microphones still wired, reels half-spooled, notes scattered on the desk like unfinished thoughts. Then one evening, as she went through his drawers, Jessi found something odd. A cassette labeled Tombstone. No date, no track listing, just that single word in Waylon's handwriting, the same sharp, hurried strokes she had seen on the letter years ago. When she played it, there was a long silence at the start, followed by Waylon's rough voice, lower than she remembered. He wasn't singing at first. He was talking. "If you're hearing this," he said, "it means I didn't fix what I broke." The tape hissed. Then a faint melody began to play, the slow, haunting rhythm of a song she didn't recognize. But halfway through, she caught a familiar line, a verse from Storms Never Last, only it wasn't the same. There was a fifth verse, one never released, one she'd never heard before. The missing verse spoke of a room with no windows, where truth was left behind, and a promise buried under the floorboards. Jessi froze. The words echoed too closely to what she remembered from Tucson, the night of the wooden box and the letter that hinted at secrets never told. In the weeks that followed, Jessi began to dig, not out of curiosity, but out of need. She searched through old notebooks, photographs, and tapes that Waylon had hidden in storage. Some reels were blank, others contained fragments, a line here, a whisper there, as if he'd been trying to confess through music what he couldn't say in words. Friends told her to let it go, to protect his legacy. But she couldn't. Every time she listened to that cassette, she felt him calling her, not from beyond the grave, but from the truth he'd tried to bury while still alive. And so, in a quiet act of defiance, Jessi began writing again. Not love songs, not ballads, but letters. Letters to Waylon, to herself, to the man she'd lost and the secrets he'd left behind. It was early 2016 when Jessi returned to the small ranch outside Tucson, the one she and Waylon had bought in the late 70s, back when love was still louder than addiction. She hadn't been there in decades. The desert had reclaimed most of it, weeds through the porch, dust thick on the window panes, silence heavy in every room. But something in her heart told her she needed to go back. In the corner of the living room, beneath a warped section of floor, she found it. The wooden box. The same one Waylon had once guarded like a secret. The lock had rusted, but it gave way under her trembling hands. Inside, neatly folded, were letters in both their handwriting, and a photograph. The photo showed them in 1978, smiling under a faded neon sign that read, Tombstone Saloon. Behind them stood a third man, barely visible, his face half in shadow. On the back of the photo, in Waylon's handwriting, were 3 words, Bury it here. As Jessi read through the letters, fragments of the past fell into place. There had been a night, one Waylon never spoke about again, when something went terribly wrong during a recording trip near Tombstone, Arizona. A friend, a musician, had overdosed. The police were never called. Waylon had panicked, buried the truth, and carried the guilt for the rest of his life. The promise buried under the floorboards wasn't just poetic. It was literal. Beneath the planks, Jessi found the missing tape reels, the original session recordings, and a note that simply read, Forgive me. Tell them the truth when you're ready. That discovery shattered her. For days, she couldn't eat or sleep. It wasn't anger she felt. It was grief for a man who had spent his final years haunted by the very thing that made him human, his mistakes. And yet, in those same letters, she saw the tenderness that had kept them together through chaos. His apologies, his hope that she'd keep singing, his belief that one day she'd find peace in telling the story he couldn't. Jessi didn't tell anyone at first. She carried the box home to Scottsdale and kept it near her piano. But soon melodies began to form. Fragile at first, then clearer. She realized the only way to set herself free was to turn confession into song. That's how her final album, Floorboards, began. It wasn't meant to be commercial, and she didn't expect radio play. It was an elegy, an act of love and closure. The title track ended with that missing 5th verse from Waylon's cassette, but this time sung in her voice, trembling and raw. By the time she recorded it, Jessi was 80. Her voice had grown fragile, but her truth had never been stronger. The last line of the song, Tucson, I kept your secret too long, was her way of letting go. By the time Floorboards was released in 2017, Jessi Colter was 74 years old. Her voice had softened, but it hadn't lost its power. If anything, it carried more weight than ever, the kind that comes only from surviving love, loss, and a lifetime of silence. She recorded the album in her modest home studio in Scottsdale, Arizona. There were no producers chasing perfection, no glossy arrangements to hide behind. Just Jessi, her piano, and the quiet hum of time passing through the walls. The project wasn't meant to be commercial. It was never about charts or airplay. Floorboards was something else. A requiem, a confession, and a closing chapter all in one. Each song was a fragment of the life she had lived with Waylon Jennings. The joy, the fire, the heartbreak, and the years of loneliness that followed his death. The title track was inspired by something deeply personal, what she discovered beneath the wooden planks of the old studio floor years after he was gone. The cassette labeled Tombstone, the faded photograph, the letter with no date, and the forgotten fifth verse of a song Waylon had never finished. That discovery became the heart of her record. She turned grief into melody and secrets into lyrics. The song Tucson told a story she had buried for decades, a night that changed everything, a promise she made and could never break. When she sang, "I Kept Your Secret Too Long," her voice trembled, not from age, but from the weight of truth. In interviews promoting the album, Jessi didn't try to rewrite history. She spoke plainly, with quiet honesty, about Waylon. His addiction, his paranoia, the rage that often tore their world apart. But she also remembered the man he tried to be. "He wasn't cruel," she said softly in one interview. "He was just drowning. And I couldn't reach him anymore." She paused, then added, "But I never stopped loving him." After Floorboards, she stopped performing publicly. The stage lights no longer called to her. Instead, she surrounded herself with memories. Waylon's guitars, his worn leather jacket, a faded photo of them at the 1971 Dripping Springs reunion, and the final note he ever left her, still pinned above the piano. On her bookshelf sat the small wooden box that had started it all. This time it wasn't hidden. It rested beside her Bible and a single framed photo of Waylon smiling, his eyes clear for once. In 2022, a small documentary crew visited her home to film a segment on women in outlaw country. When the young interviewer asked what she most wanted people to remember about Waylon, Jessi looked down for a long time before answering. "He wanted to be better," she said. "He just didn't know how." Then she smiled faintly and added, "Maybe peace isn't what you find. Maybe it's what you leave behind." That night, after the crew left, she sat alone at her piano. She played Floorboards one more time. Slow, deliberate, her fingers trembling slightly. When the final note faded, she whispered into the quiet, "Good night, Waylon." For Jesse Coulter, the music had finally stopped. But for the first time in decades, the silence felt like peace. Some secrets are too heavy to carry, and some loves never really fade. They just find new ways to sing. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. Do you think love can survive the truth? And don't forget to like and subscribe, so more untold stories like Jessi's can finally be heard.